Dear ladies and gentlemen, we are happy to have you here at the final discussion in our Understanding China Power series with Bonnie Glaser from the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And the title of her presentation today is China's Power Projection Efforts Near and Far. Like I mentioned, this is the final series. We have already covered the topics of Chinese investments to Europe, human rights violations in Xinjiang, EU-China relations, and today, as the grand finale, we will hear a talk from Bonnie Glaser, who is the director of the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. She was previously senior advisor for Asia and the director of China Power Project at the Center of Strategic and International Studies. And currently, she's the host of China Global podcast. This is a must-listen podcast for everybody, for anybody interested in China-related matters and its global reach. I'm a long-time listener myself, and I advise everybody to start doing the same. And today's lecture will cover the topics from its core interest of Taiwan and the South China Sea. China has increased its power projection efforts, hard and soft, in new and more complex ways over the past 5 years. Expanding further afield from mainland China, new initiatives and efforts also impact states throughout the Indo-Pacific region in ways ranging from the string of pearls ports facilities to investments in ASEAN states. The Belt and Road Initiative is a global effort that serves as a vehicle for China's power projection efforts in Central Asia, South Asia, Africa, and the Arctic, and increasingly in Europe. China's efforts are not limited to geography. We also see efforts in multilateral forums, especially in UN bodies, to also influence global norms and rules. After Bonnie's presentation, we will have short time for book presentation. Recently published book by Estonian Foreign Policy Institute at ICDS in collaboration with the Finnish Institute of International Affairs and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. The book will be presented by the editors Kristi Raik, Bart Gaens, and Frank Jüris. The discussion is moderated by Frank Jüris, by me. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Bonnie, please.
Well, thank you so much, Frank. It's a privilege to have the opportunity today to give this lecture to the International Center for Defense and Security in Tallinn. I had very much hoped that I would be able to visit in person, but unfortunately we had to postpone. And I will be giving this talk virtually and hope that some months down the road that I will actually be able to visit in person. So I'm going to load my slide deck and share that with you if I can. I'm going to start by talking about the ends, and then we will talk about the ways and the means. So we'll start with Xi Jinping's national objectives that he set out in his speech at the 19th Party Congress. And this, of course, was when he started his second term in office. And we all expect that Xi Jinping will be starting his third term in office next year, and that will be for another 5 years. But this was a very critical moment in 2017, in the fall, when Xi Jinping articulated a set of targets for 2035 and 2049. And the goals, I think, for 2035 are even more important because Xi Jinping may still be in power by then. He will not be in power in 2049, at least according to actuarial tables. He is unlikely to be alive. But the near term is really critical, because if China doesn't reach its near-term goals in 2035, then really the odds of reaching those 2049 goals are very slim. So I think that actually these goals are quite urgent for Xi Jinping, and they are general, but of course they have specific plans behind them. So again, we will get to the ways and means, but realizing socialist modernization, becoming a global leader in innovation, boosting Chinese soft power, and basically completing PLA modernization. The mid-century goal of becoming, of achieving national rejuvenation, this has been a goal of Chinese leaders, of course, for a very, very long time. It has never really been defined. It could mean China being a top superpower, the global superpower in the world. And I'm going to talk more specifically next about what I think China's goals are regionally and globally. So regionally, I think essentially China wants to be the hegemon of East Asia, maybe of Asia more broadly. But China doesn't frame the geographic region as the Indo-Pacific, which increasingly many countries do, including, of course, Australia and India and the United States, and many countries in Europe now releasing, of course, in recent years, their own Indo-Pacific strategies. China still talks very much about the Asian region, which excludes, of course, the United States. The U.S. is a Pacific power; it is not an Asian power. And China has at times talked about how it wants to organize countries in the region, create a new security mechanism that would include just Asian countries. And China, of course, would lead that. So China does want to reduce U.S. influence and military presence, eliminate U.S. alliances, persuade neighbors to accommodate and prioritize PRC interests. So countries are supposed to show deference to China's interests and not challenge Chinese interests, particularly sovereignty. Taiwan is very much, of course, a high priority for China. In my view, we can talk about this later in the discussion. I don't think that it is a top priority in terms of the near-term goals of China. I do not believe that it is in China's interest to reunify Taiwan by force. It's a much better outcome for Beijing if it can achieve reunification in a peaceful way and integrate Taiwan into China without having to shed bloodshed. And then, of course, settling all territorial disputes on PRC terms. So that includes, of course, South China Sea, East China Sea, and I'll talk a little bit about some of these later. And so what are China's foreign policy objectives globally? You can see my list here. I don't list here that China has the ambition to be the top country in the world, to supplant the United States as the number one. It may, from my perspective, it may have that goal. It has not demonstrated yet, I think, that it has that ambition. But as China rises, it's my expectation that its ambitions will evolve globally. And so even if we don't see hard evidence of that today, I do think that in the future, potentially, we will see evidence of China having the ambition. Right now, we see China having the goal of leading global governance reform, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But if any of you are interested in a great book on grand strategy, a friend of mine who's now one of the directors for China at the National Security Council in the United States, Rush Doshi, has just published a book called The Long Game, in which he argues that China has the ambition to displace the United States as the leading global superpower. I think the evidence is a bit thin. But again, I don't rule out that that's ultimately where China will go. Goals are not static, of course, that countries have, and China is no exception in that regard. But I do see evidence that China wants to resolve parts of the international order, make it more favorable to China, certainly introduce autocratic norms into the international order. There's a great deal of evidence for that. It wants to assert PRC leadership over a growing number of international organizations. We see this at the UN, for example. Again, prevent damage to PRC interests, so that's not only regional, but also global. And overall to shape the international environment so it's more favorable to China. And increasingly, I see evidence that it is promoting what it calls the China solution, the Zhongguo Fang'an. This isn't necessarily completely a wholesale Chinese development model of socialism with Chinese characteristics, but pieces of that development model. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit going forward. So now I want to move to talking about what are the ways and means of China's grand strategy. And the centrality of technology in Xi Jinping's policy has become increasingly clear. China believes that the world is experiencing a new wave of technological innovation. So this is sometimes referred to as the fourth industrial revolution. And that includes, of course, artificial intelligence and quantum computing and biotechnology, smart manufacturing, and even now sovereign digital currencies. And this new wave is seen as providing an opportunity for China to eventually overtake the West in many areas of technology. So Xi Jinping appears to believe that technology dominance will not only enable the country to become more powerful and achieve national rejuvenation, but importantly, because technology is linked to supply chains, to trade patterns, to financial power and information flows, dominance will help China to shape the international order in its preferred direction. So technology is very central to Xi Jinping's entire strategy. And here what you see is a picture of Made in China 2025. And when that was put forward by Xi Jinping, it was really the first time that China so explicitly said that it wanted to become dominant in these very important 21st century strategic technologies. Since then, we've seen the AI 2030 plan, the Standards 2035 plan. These are industrial strategies, and China's no stranger to industrial strategy. There's many of them. Its five-year plans really are industrial strategies. Whether or not they are able to attain these goals is another question. China doesn't always achieve what it sets out to achieve in its industrial strategies. But there's many ways that it is doing this, not only through its policies at home, also by purchasing foreign companies, certainly by intellectual property theft, and we see that continuing. Its Thousand Talents program, it attracts people mostly of ethnic Chinese origin, but not exclusively, to come back to China to contribute to the overall national rejuvenation effort of the country. And then this larger military civil fusion strategy, which I think is also very important for China to make it easier for China to transfer what is being developed in the civilian sector and the military sector to move freely between both of those sectors. Chinese leaders have long used the phrase "catch up and surpass" to describe their technological ambitions. And so this is very key, that it's not only catch up, it is, at least in the technology area, to surpass. And the last thing that I want to note on the digital currencies piece is that we have seen progress where China has now introduced the digital renminbi. This is a way to bypass the US payments infrastructure and weaken the dominance of the US dollar. So this is a way for China to blunt US financial advantages in the currency area. And this is something that I think increasingly people are quite concerned about. So I'm going to talk about China's economic statecraft. And I'm going to talk about the positive inducements and then talk a little bit about the coercion side. So, and on this slide, we see, of course, a picture of the Belt and Road. And this shows, I think, the way that I interpret the Belt and Road. This is not just aimed at connectivity. It is aimed at reshaping global alignments and reshaping the international order through infrastructure lending and tying countries to the extent possible to China's economy, and tying countries to China geographically, and using economic leverage to gain political leverage over countries. So if we look at all of the available levers that China has, the economic lever is so much stronger today than the other levers it might have. Its diplomatic levers, I think, are weaker. Its military levers, although expanding, are still weaker than the economic levers. So one of the things China is also able to do through the Belt and Road is to begin to set standards in project development and operation, bidding and procurement and tendering. So this is something that I think is of concern to many democratic countries. And also China is promoting these China origin tech standards. So we see this in the push of Huawei, ZTE, other Chinese telecommunication countries, also its own tech standards in transportation. The last bullet that points to port access, I think, is a question mark today in military foothold. So we see a lot of Chinese investment in ports. There's 95 ports today globally that China is invested in, but only one of those is a military base, that is in Djibouti. And I think that China will have great difficulty actually transforming many of those ports into real military bases, but they may be access points for China, and they're indeed referred to as strategic strongholds in Chinese, where the Chinese will, the PLA Navy ships will be able to replenish and maybe do some maintenance, have R&R, and so essentially for the time being, these are primarily commercial, and we will have to see the extent to which they develop into military spaces for the PLA Navy. So this was just a great map that Merrick's did in Germany that I thought I would show. It's from 2018, but I don't think things have changed that much since then. But you can see many here, many of the ports, they're not all here, but you can see they're really all located at strategic slack points where you have sea lanes of communication where China then wants to ensure that it gains access and maybe potentially in the future even deny access to others. But I think its priority today is to ensure access for China's commercial ships and railroads, of course, throughout the Eurasian continent. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about coercion. This list by no means includes every example of coercion we have seen. It would probably take 3 slides. There's been some good work at ASPI in Australia, I think, where they have examined every case that shows any component of coercion. But these are some of the leading examples. And I put an asterisk next to 3 of them that are ongoing in a very prominent way, and that is Australia, Canada, and Lithuania. Lithuania, of course, your neighbor, is just the most recent example of a country that is being targeted by Chinese economic coercion. And there's a list here of the precipitating action of each one of those episodes. It really started in 2008 with France when pro-Tibetan protesters were disrupting the Olympic torch as it was traveling to China for the Olympics, and the Chinese citizens boycotted the French supermarket Carrefour. And then we saw the Norway Peace Prize Committee award the Peace Prize to Liu Xiaobo, who eventually died in prison, and China tried to cut off salmon imports. Australia stands today as the most far-reaching example of economic coercion, where the Chinese have not tried to deny that they are blocking the import of Australian goods. They have said even in some official cases, they have admitted that they are using economic coercion. Most of these cases, they deny they're doing anything. And in the Australian case, they actually gave the Australians a list of 14 demands of steps that they have to take as a country in their civil society as well as in their government policy in order to return the China-Australia relationship to normal. This list, I think, is going to expand further. China is not always successful in these cases, but at least it is successful in warning other countries. In Chinese, we call this, there's a phrase of killing the chicken to scare the monkey. So they're basically killing Australia to scare other countries to not follow Australia's example, particularly in calling for an international investigation of the origins of COVID-19. And I think that the Chinese have seen as very dangerous to the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. So now I want to talk briefly about the military situation. These are the island chains, the first island chain, the second island chain. And what we have seen is that China is developing what we call anti-access area denial capabilities that would put at risk foreign naval vessels, foreign aircraft operating in these spaces near China in a crisis. So in peacetime, China is not seriously interfering with the passage of ships, certainly not commercial ships. They are occasionally warning Navy ships that sail in the South China Sea. But their ambitions in a crisis are far greater, and they've developed things like you can see on your bottom right of your screen, the DF-26 missile, which is called the aircraft carrier killer, which the Chinese have tested against a moving target in the South China Sea. What we've seen for the past decade is China's Navy is focused on developing these capabilities. And also amphibious landing capabilities, which it would use against Taiwan, sea control capabilities, and more distant blue water missions. So this is seen as extremely worrisome by the United States. And the recent decision just this past week to help Australia develop nuclear-powered submarines is very much aimed at strengthening deterrence and strengthening the position of the United States and its allies and preventing China from succeeding in implementing sea control in this area. I like this slide just to be able to show very visually how quickly the Chinese have caught up in terms of the quality and the quantity of their land-based ballistic missiles. The Chinese have the largest inventory of land-based ballistic missiles in the world. In 1996, they had very small numbers, the DF-11s and 15, and they could only go very short range. And that there were tens of missiles. And then you can see this evolution in each one of the slides, 2003, 2010, 2017. The numbers of missiles have increased. The range of missiles has increased. I need to update the slide to 2021. But of course, what this shows is China now has thousands of missiles, and over 100 of them can actually reach Guam. So Andersen Air Force Base is located in Guam, and that's at the bottom right of your screen. So this has really been a very rapid buildup on China's part. So turning to the South China Sea, I always like to talk a little bit about what's at stake in the South China Sea. There's certainly the ownership of the land features, and Vietnam and the Philippines and Malaysia, Taiwan, Brunei all have claims in the South China Sea. There's the safety of commercial shipping, which in my former job at CSIS, I had a team. We tried to estimate what the actual annual trade is that goes through the South China Sea. And we estimated that it's close to about 3.4 trillion annually. Freedom of navigation is always talked about very prominently by the US Navy. We do not want China to be blocking access by any navy. All navies have the right to all of the waters around the world, including 12 nautical mile territorial seas. So innocent passage is allowed under the convention of the law of the sea. And China, of course, does not allow access and demands that permission be granted by the coastal state. There are other countries that have that position as well. China's not alone, but there are these disagreements under UNCLOS. Also at stake is the rules-based order in international law, and we know that in July of 2016, the ruling that came down by an arbitral tribunal found that China's 9-dash line, which you see pictured on that map there, it does not have any standing in international law. Regional peace and stability. And then that last bullet, I think, is the most important to all of the claimants, and that is the rights to resources, to fish, to oil and gas, that China is often denying them from developing. And there's many examples of China harassing, using law enforcement ships and its maritime militia, which I show here, intimidating other claimants. The picture on the left shows the episode in 2014 where China emplaced an oil rig within Vietnam's exclusive economic zone, and many Vietnamese ships harassed the oil rig. China did withdraw it over 1 month earlier than it had planned to. It claimed that the Chinese claimed they had finished their operations, but we don't really know whether, in fact, the Vietnamese very strong reaction played a part in their decision making. And then you can see an example from CSIS. There's the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative. One of my former colleagues, Greg Poling, has done a great job through looking at, he's been tracking AIS signals that show where Chinese ships are. And that's just an example of a 6-week period showing you how many Chinese law enforcement vessels were operating in this area that is claimed by Malaysia and Brunei, and was also operating in Indonesia's EEZs. And the bottom right shows you just pictures of maritime militia ships, which have been used by China repeatedly in the South China Sea to harass other countries. And we've seen this quite often in around the Philippines. So I'll talk briefly about Taiwan. This is an episode that took place in March of 2019 when China's military aircraft crossed what we call this sort of the center line, which doesn't really exist. It was drawn by the United States in the 50s, and China's never recognized it, although it is tacitly recognized and very rarely crossed that line. The last time it had done so was 20 years previously in 1999. So here we are in March of 2019, Chinese jets crossed that center line. We have been seeing since then regular, almost weekly, sometimes several times in a week, Chinese operations in Taiwan's air defense identification zone, and sometimes not only with fighter jets, but with HK-6 bombers. These are nuclear capable bombers. They are intended to intimidate Taiwan. The PLA tells me they need to exercise, and so they operate, they're now circumnavigating Taiwan. And Taiwan's Ministry of Defense has a website where they post the information about how many aircraft, where they went, whether they crossed the center line. So this is very dangerous. And I have a quote here on this slide from January 2019, when Xi Jinping gave his only speech, comprehensive speech on Taiwan. And he stated in that speech, our country must be reunified and will surely be reunified. And he reiterated that reunification is critical to the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation in the new era, which has stimulated a debate about whether or not he has now set a deadline of 2049. In other words, China cannot rejuvenate without becoming unified with Taiwan. Many Chinese experts tell me that's not the case, that that's not the way they interpret it. But this is a debate that is ongoing. Our Indo-PACOM commander, who stepped down earlier this year, but he testified before Congress and stated Taiwan is clearly one of China's positions, and that threat is manifest during this decade, in fact, during the next 6 years. So there are people in the US military at very senior levels who believe that China is close to having the military capabilities to seize and control Taiwan. The implications of that would be very radical for the rest of the region, and I think democracies globally. So I'm going to talk about China's ambition to revise the international order. This is a very important way in which I think China is trying to influence the world so it is more favorable to China and less favorable to democracies around the world. They are trying to create parallel institutions. And you see the list on the left-hand side of the screen. The first was the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and then we have BRICS and the Asian Infrastructure Bank and the CICA, Conference on Interaction and Confidence Building Measures in Asia. None of these, I think, have really had very significant implications yet. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I think the United States had feared would have far more far-reaching impact than it has. The US also feared that the Asian Infrastructure Bank would be used in a way that would be damaging to democratic countries. But so far, I would say that it has not. I'm worried more about what's on the right side of the slide, at least at the moment, and that is the injection of new rules and norms into the international system. China is very active in the Human Rights Council at the UN, where it is promoting its own interpretation of human rights, very top-down, doesn't include civil society, doesn't recognize really individual rights, certainly doesn't recognize any universal definition of human rights. So we've seen under Xi Jinping this ambition to, in global governance, where China used to talk about participating in global governance reform and then guiding global governance reform. And then in June of 2018, Xi Jinping said China must lead global governance reform. So increasingly, China seeks to set rules for the international system. And its vision of global governance, I think we should expect, is similar to the governance that is being implemented domestically. After all, why would China promote a global governance and international order that's very different than what it's doing at home? And if we look at the authoritarian shift in China, we should all be worried about the push of authoritarianism into the global system. China's efforts, of course, to reform the global system are centered in the UN because Beijing views the UN as the core of the governance system, and it has succeeded in inserting the Belt and Road Initiative, its Community of Shared Future, into many UN resolutions, and this helps, I think, China to displace liberal values and to legitimize globalize norms and principles that China favors. So China has a regional hubs and spokes strategy. You're certainly most familiar with that slide at the bottom that now needs to be revised. That is, of course, what was the 17+1 is now the 16+1. We also have the FOCAC for Africa, the China-Arab Forum, CELAC, which is the Latin America region. So China has many of these regional efforts to bring countries together and deal with them as blocks, essentially. And this is having, it's more successful in some place than others. It will be interesting to see what happens going forward with the 16+1. I'm particularly interested in where Estonia stands on this issue. In Latin America, China's efforts have stumbled as well, but they have been probably, I think, most effective in the China-Africa Forum. But even there have been disappointments in some African countries about China's policies. So then I wanted to briefly just show the slide. This talks about China's authoritarian technologies that it is pushing in the international system, and surveillance technologies, of course, are very popular around the world. This is not only what I would call the supply side. It's not only a problem of China pushing this out into the world. It's the demand side. Countries want to have these capabilities. Many dictatorships and authoritarian governments want to control their citizens. And certainly some of these technologies can be used just to control crime. It's not the technologies themselves that are the problem. It's the way they are used. So there are many cities in the world. London probably has more surveillance cameras than any other city in the world. So the problem really is where it's used. And you can see on that map where Chinese technology is being promoted, sold around the world. There's a quote I have on the left side of that slide, which I do want to highlight when we talk about whether or not China wants to export its development model. Xi Jinping did say at that 19th Party Congress that China's path provides a new option for other countries and nations who want to speed up their development while preserving their independence. And China tried to reverse that a few months later, where Xi Jinping said, no, we're not exporting our system. But I pay a lot of attention to that statement because I think China overstepped. There was a backlash from countries, and so they decided to not emphasize that at the moment. But I actually believe that China is trying to push out components, elements of its development model into the international system. I also want to just talk a little bit about China's discourse power, the Huayuquan. China's rise as a great power requires legitimacy. It's not enough if China just has the biggest economy in the world measured by GDP, and it will probably get there. But China wants the recognition of the rest of the world that it is a great power and that it has arrived. So it has to be accommodated by the international system and accepted by the international community. And one of the means that China is doing in order to gain international legitimacy is to promote what it sees as a correct understanding of China as a benevolent, responsible power, a champion of multilateralism, a leader of the developing world, and it's developing its own discourse. It talks about the community of shared future for mankind and peaceful development, which used to be peaceful rise under Hu Jintao in the early years, and then changed to peaceful development. It's pushing this new type of international relations and win-win cooperation. One of my friends, Malin Out, and some of her colleagues at the Wallenberg Institute in Sweden did this wonderful report called the Decoding China Dictionary, where they tried to explain what does China mean by win-win cooperation. It's obviously not as benign as it sounds. Some people make a joke and say it means China wins twice. But this is really to promote China's discourse power. Just a couple more slides. Disinformation, I see, is relatively new for China. It's interesting to me. We know that Russia has used this kind of disinformation for a long time. But in my view, this really started in earnest with China during COVID-19. The Chinese view it as very threatening that countries in the world think that this started in China, that it might have leaked from the lab in Wuhan. And so the Chinese, very early on, you can see in the bottom right-hand slide, the Chinese suggested that the US Army might have brought the epidemic to Wuhan. The Chinese were holding the World Games in Wuhan at the time, in fact, of the Party Congress. And I was in Beijing at the time, and I was attending a meeting. I remember the World Games was taking place at the same time. So the Chinese tried to suggest, it was the US fault. Then now they're saying that maybe it's a US military lab in Maryland that is the source of the disinformation of the virus. One of the funny stories that I like to share is this slide on the top right, which you probably can't see very clearly, but basically there was a woman who had very few Twitter followers, and she didn't really, she's not an international affairs expert, and she suggested that maybe COVID-19 started in America because she said there were many cases of the flu. There were more people sick and dying than usual in 2019. So she said, so maybe the flu shot didn't work. And so it turns out this woman was just a housewife. And the Chinese must have been going through Twitter to look for things that they could use in their disinformation campaign. So Zhao Lijian, who of course is the head of the information office at the foreign ministry, retweeted this and said, so, basically here's evidence. It could have started in the United States. And this woman, who her Twitter handle is the Lizard King, came back and said, those were my shower musings. I have no evidence that this is true at all. But I'll bet the Chinese had a lot of attention, resources they were paying to look for evidence that they could use for disinformation. And then finally, we have the overseas political influence activities. This is a very important set of means that the Chinese use to promote their narrative around the world. The targets are all listed on the left. We've seen this in countries like Australia, where the Chinese are very active in their political influence activities. And the targets were, in Australia, individual legislators, the states and local governments, individual politicians, where the Chinese were making some campaign contributions when that was still legal in Australia. Now they have passed legislation to make it illegal. But this continues, of course, at universities, think tanks, the Chinese diaspora, which is very, very large in Australia. So there's been some good research done in Australia. I would say that these activities are probably global. Not all countries have woken up to the problem. They vary from country to country. There's some certainly more active in some countries than others. But if the laws are absent to try and limit the influence that these activities have, then the impact on democracy, of course, can be quite negative. My very last slide is just to ask the question, because I think it is important. I think cooperation with China is important. We're all worried about climate change, about proliferation, about where the next pandemic might take place. We're concerned about Iran and North Korea and their nuclear programs. And China can play a role in trying to stem the tide of the spread of nuclear weapons. It must play a role in lowering global emissions, because it is the biggest global emitter today of these carbon gases. So it is essential, I think, to cooperate. Right now, the United States has put forward a strategy similar to the EU of essentially competing with China and cooperating where we can, but competing, and we also say confronting where necessary. And the EU has also said China is a strategic rival, but it's also a cooperator. So the question remains whether China will cooperate with the world. It is a two-way street. And so far, China is, at least with the United States, saying that cooperation is not possible unless the overall atmosphere in the US-China relationship improves. This is essentially what Xi Jinping said to President Biden in his phone call just over a week ago, that we have to create the right conditions in order for cooperation to take place. So I hope it will take place. But at least today, I'm rather skeptical. So that's the end of my presentation, and I look forward to hearing the presentation about the book and the Arctic, and then I hope that we can have a conversation together.
Thank you, Bonnie. We couldn't have asked for a more fitting final talk from the series, as it was comprehensive and thought-provoking at the same time. So thank you from the bottom of my heart, and we really look forward to still have you here present in Tallinn. So please, everybody, stay tuned. But without further ado, one more thing I wanted to remind that the participants or listeners can already start writing questions under the chat function of Teams. And after we have the book presentation, Nordic-Baltic connectivity with Asia via the Arctic, assessing opportunities and risks, presented by the editors, Kristi, Raik, the head of Estonian Foreign Policy Institute, leading researcher Bart Gaens from Finnish Institute of International Affairs, and EFPI's researcher, myself. We will give the floor or start with the Q&A session. So just to remind you, when you write your questions in the Q&A or this chat function, please write your name and your affiliation so that we will know who asked the question. But without further ado, I'll give the floor to Kristi, please.
Thank you very much, Frank, and thank you also on my behalf to Bonnie Glaser. Indeed, it was a very informative and excellent overview of China's power projection. And now, while the audience is thinking about questions to Bonnie Glaser, we are offering this little interlude to present the book that is just out of print. This is how it looks like. Unfortunately, we could not do a physical event, otherwise you would have been able to take the book with you. But there will be other occasions to actually to hand out the book, and anyone interested can also drop by in the office and get a copy. So why we thought this book actually is relevant for the main topic today is that the book looks a lot at the growing role and interest of China in the Arctic. And the starting point for the book is that we have in the Arctic like three major developments. First of all, we have the very rapid climate change, global warming being at least twice as quick in the Arctic as in the rest of the world. Then secondly, we have new economic opportunities opening up and opportunities to increase connectivity from the Nordic Baltic states to Asia via the Arctic as an alternative route. There is a strong Chinese interest in that possibility. There is an interest of the Nordic Baltic countries. But then there is the third dynamic, and that is the growing geo-economic and geopolitical competition that plays out in the Arctic. And what we find out in the book is that the consideration of the economic interests and economic opportunities and connectivity potential is very much kind of underpinned by the geopolitical goals of the different players. And so we have Russia as the traditional Arctic power with growing military presence, and for Russia it is really the military role in the Arctic that kind of dominates over the economic interests. Then again, for China, it's maybe the economic statecraft that is the main approach, but it is imbued with the kind of broader strategic and security interests, which Frank will talk about soon. And then we have the Nordic Baltic countries, which would be interested, of course, in more cooperation in the Arctic and in making use of the economic opportunities, but that have become increasingly wary and kind of acknowledging also the risks that come with the geoeconomic and geopolitical competition, and kind of thinking about what are the implications if the connectivity can be increased. It's not just about economic opportunities, but we also need to think through the risks. So this is what the book is about. It's looking at the perspectives of the different players, the major powers, and then the Nordic Baltic states. And we have a number of colleagues from the Nordic and Baltic countries and Germany who have contributed. I'm really grateful to all of them. I know some of them are actually following the event today. So thank you to all of you. And now I will give the word to Bart Gaens, who is one of the editors, and he will tell us a bit more about the conceptual framework of the book.
Thanks, Kristi. Hope you can hear me. And also thank you, Bonnie, for an excellent presentation. And on my behalf, apologies for being the only one without a professional screen behind me. Please allow me to make my own intervention very brief. I would just like to point out 3 conclusions or key findings from our book, and they actually all have to do with connectivity, which was the key theme of the publication that is being launched today. Now, in our presentation just now, Bonnie Glaser has argued that the Belt and Road Initiative serves as a tool for economic statecraft, for China to project power, to promote its economic development model, and even to reshape regional alignments. And I think importantly, she also said that China's efforts are not limited to infrastructure, but they also include attempts to promote and establish new norms and rules. And I think this shows that connectivity in all its dimensions certainly has become one of the megatrends of the 21st century. Now, this concept of connectivity that we have been applying includes obviously infrastructure projects, but it's also about soft components such as socio-cultural exchange, digital connectivity, and also regulatory frameworks. Now, this implies that connectivity development, such as the one supported by China through its Polar Silk Road as part of the BRI, that this has consequences for issues like regional geopolitics, security, and environmental and socio-economic sustainability, but certainly also for governance, international law, and human rights. So that's my first point, that not least because of China's strategy and China's ambitions through the BRI, connectivity is increasingly becoming a part of the discussions also on the Arctic. Now, my second point is very much related to that, and that is that connectivity is driving great power competition, as Kristi also pointed out just now. And this power game is certainly also getting to be very visible in the Arctic. In the book, we argue that a shift can be observed from the Arctic as a so-called exceptional zone of peace and stability and positive interdependence, more to a region that shows tightening great power competition between Russia and the United States, but along the more also including China. In this context, the book confirms the continued importance of the so-called traditional geopolitics. But in addition to this, the book also applies the vantage point of geoeconomics, also called economic statecraft, which basically means power politics through economic means. Now, from the perspective of the Nordic-Baltic region, it is clear that this geopolitical as well as geoeconomic competition between great powers obviously poses certain challenges. And the book argues that responses and policy shifts by Nordic and Baltic countries are already visible. These challenges are well illustrated in several chapters in the book, such as the chapters on Russia's expansion of military infrastructure in the Arctic, on Russia's energy policy, on security threats posed by potential investments by China in the region, or on the link between Chinese investments and potential human rights abuses, for example. Now, thirdly, and also to maybe finish on a more positive note, the book also partly argues that Arctic connectivity offers avenues for cooperation on certain issues. At least that is the case for some authors, and perhaps there they disagree a little bit with Bonnie's interpretation that is more skeptical, let's say. So in the book, there are indeed chapters that argue that connectivity and so-called economic geography, as it's called in the theory chapter of the book, that it can drive forward international cooperation and result in positive sum dynamics. There's one chapter, for example, that argues for a cautious bilateral as well as multilateral cooperation with China in the field of climate change mitigation in the Arctic, for example, in particular through scientific cooperation. There's another chapter that explores potential for EU-Japan cooperation in the Arctic region. And yet another chapter argues that Russia's dependence on hydrocarbon culture, which itself is dependent on Arctic resources, also necessitates the need to acquire energy technology from the West. And this paradoxically perhaps provides a window of opportunity to cooperate with Russia to promote more socially and environmentally responsible policies and practices. So at least for us, and also to conclude, it's not all bad news. In addition to the ongoing competition in the Arctic, there are perhaps limited possibilities for international cooperation as well. So that's it for me, and I hope that you all will have the time to take a more in-depth look at the book. And of course, we would very much welcome any comments and feedback. So thank you very much. And on that note, I'll now yield the floor to Frank. Thank you.
Thank you, Bart. I will give a short overview of the chapter I wrote to provoke your interest, not only read my chapter, but the whole book in itself. And as a teaser, we also have two excellent chapters from Lithuanian authors for anybody who's interested in finding out about the current state of Lithuania-China relations. But without further ado, I will introduce quickly the key findings. In 2018, China's Arctic Policy White Paper, published by the State Council Information Office, it's also the nameplate for Central Propaganda Department, failed to mention Chinese security interest in the Arctic, which are the focus of my chapter. Chinese strategic thinking is inspired by the 19th century US naval officer Alfred Mahan, who believed that states' international standing depends on the might of its navy. China, to be contender for top spot, must be able to pose challenge to the US, not only regionally, as mentioned by Bonnie, for instance, in South and East China Sea, but also globally, including the Arctic Ocean. Military white paper published in 2019 stressed the importance of developing blue water navy with support ports to protect its overseas interest. China already has stakes in 12 European ports and has shown interest towards developing strategic infrastructure in the Nordic Baltic region. For example, Tallinn, Klaipeda, and Kirkenes and Lysadil ports. Also, China has shown interest towards Old Navy port and airports in Greenland and Finland, Tallinn-Helsinki Tunnel, and the Arctic Railway connecting Finnish polar regions with its railway network. So far, China has not been able to gain foothold in the region due to security, environmental, and feasibility concerns. Estonian Foreign Intelligence Service has depicted Chinese investments in strategic infrastructure through the lens of geoeconomics and the dependencies it creates that China has on several occasions used for its own benefit and for political reasons. Just to add to Bonnie's impressive list on the sanctions, Estonia and Lithuania faced, after hosting Dalai Lama separately, sanctions from China in 2011 and 2013. In Russia's Arctic, Chinese scholars have chosen 5 ports: Murmansk, Arkhangelsk, Sabeta, Ulen, and Dixie, with the highest potential for development based on location, climate, population, and existing infrastructure and projects. In mayhem spirits, Chinese scholars argue that ports are seen as fulcrum points for promoting development, and with it, Chinese influence deeper into Russia's hinterland, as 2 of the chosen ports are on the Lena and Ob estuaries, which of course is a concern for Kremlin, as Chinese exchanges in the Arctic often bypass the government. One example of it is China-Russia Arctic Forum, held since 2012, with target audiences from scientists, local leaders, private sector, and international organizations. Forum aims to generate necessary soft power for the acceptance of China as a near Arctic state and as an Arctic stakeholder that is believed to support China's economic engagement and capacity building. For capacity building, Chinese universities and institutes related to the military and defense industry, some of them even called 7 Sons of National Defense, have established Arctic research centers with Russian counterparts. Particularly interesting to the Nordic-Baltic region is Sino-Russian cooperation in underwater acoustic sensing that can be used for target detection and anti-submarine warfare. Finnish state-led project Arctic Connect promises to connect internet users from Europe and Russia and Asia with underwater fiber optic cable along the Northern Sea route. With the use of distributed acoustic sensing technology established in 2006 already, the cables can be used for underwater target detection. As the platform provider is Chinese company Huawei Marine, Chinese intelligence gathering and cybersecurity capabilities would improve. In addition, China-Russia jointly built capacities in underwater acoustic sensing could be used for the benefit of both sides' nuclear deterrence in a strategically important Arctic region against their shared adversary, the USA. This should be of concern to the US and its allies, as the NATO's northern flank's defense starts in the Arctic. Thank you. And now we can see if we already have questions. Excellent. We have first question to Bonnie Glaser from Mohammed Gibran from the transnational organized crime, who is a transnational organized crime analyst. And the question is, what is your opinion towards China's lack of contribution in assisting international efforts to determine the origin of COVID-19? Thank you.
Well, this is an interesting question because to me, it demonstrates that party rule, that the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party is really the top priority for Xi Jinping. And we, of course, have seen this since he came to power in late 2012. And the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party and its rule supersedes the importance of China being seen as a responsible global power internationally. So that is a goal, but it's a secondary goal. And so therefore, China, as I mentioned in the case of Australia and its coming out publicly and calling for an international independent investigation, was seen as threatening Chinese Communist Party legitimacy. And so this is a major challenge for the international community because, of course, really understanding the origins of this pandemic are so important in preventing the next one. And I think that we're all concerned about ending this one, let alone preventing what could be even worse pandemics in the future. And China's collaboration is really essential. And I think increasingly scientists are worried that we will never know the origins of COVID-19. Did it come from an animal? Was it in a seafood market, as it was believed in the case of SARS in 2003, or was it something entirely different? It could have been an accidental lab leak. I myself believe that that it was probably not a deliberate lab leak, but an accidental lab leak is always possible. There are safety issues. No lab has 100% security and safety. So what I think this really tells us is that China will always put its domestic needs, its domestic interests, and the interests of the party before the interests of its people and the global public. And that should be of concern to all of us.
Thank you, Bonnie, for a comprehensive and good answer. I encourage everybody to ask questions. Just keep in mind that the questions are only for Bonnie Glaser, and when asking the question, please also state your affiliation. So we have a next question from Mirja Mait from Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Could you please briefly discuss China's interest and potential future role in Afghanistan and its wider region?
Well, China's interests in Afghanistan, of course, are primarily stability and not having that country be a safe haven for terrorists. And in the past, we have seen with the Taliban allowing these terrorists to operate in Afghanistan, and ultimately there have been Uyghur terrorists that have been trained there. So China has long had an interest in stability, and I think their biggest concern now, and they have tried to extract pledges from the Taliban that they will not allow terrorists to run rampant in their country and eventually even cross borders into China. The Chinese, of course, have other interests as well. They have economic interests. In years past, they had the INAC copper mine, for example, which was never very successful. But some people think that in the long term, if there is stability in the region, that China will provide a great deal of economic assistance and try to integrate Afghanistan into its Belt and Road. The Belt and Road has pretty much gone around Afghanistan. But there is the potential, of course. People have shown how there could be maybe an oil pipeline through Afghanistan. I myself think that this is unlikely to happen in the near term. I think that China will be very careful about investing too quickly and too much in Afghanistan until they really are certain that there is stability. And the Chinese, I think, are trying to use the leverage they have to ensure that the Taliban does prevent Afghanistan from being used in a way that would damage Chinese interests. And the biggest lever that China has right now is recognizing the Taliban as the government. And I think it's only a matter of time, but I think China's trying to use that to get what it needs from the new government in Afghanistan. And then China will use the provision of additional economic assistance. It's given some limited assistance so far to the new government. It's primarily humanitarian aid, but they might give more economic assistance and investment if they can get what they need. So we go back to talking about win-win cooperation. China expects to get something in return. So I think China does have significant interest in Afghanistan, but frankly, it doesn't want this country and its problems put in China's lap, because China doesn't have the ambition or the resources to really solve all the problems in Afghanistan. And I guess what I mean when I say that I'm not sure China wants to be a sort of global superpower is it just doesn't want to be the world policeman in the same way that the United States has been. That would detract from China's ambition to achieve national rejuvenation. I think the Chinese are really wary of getting sucked into crises around the world that will then prevent it from achieving the goals that it has domestically.
Thank you. Another question from Toomas Jermalevičius. He's the head of research in ICDS. And the question goes, in the past, when making choices between economic development and environmental protection, more often than not, the CCP had prioritized the former. Is climate emergency producing any shifts in thinking or between various fractions of the CCP? To what extent the CCP views the climate emergency as a real threat, not in narrow sense as a threat to its hold on power, but much more broadly as a threat in severe consequences to the entire planet? Thank you.
So I don't have data at my fingertips, but I think that there's growing evidence that the Chinese do see climate change as a threat, and not just in the sense of threat to the political system and the party, but they have seen the environmental changes in China. And they recognize that, the first big recognition, of course, was air pollution, the coal burning in the cities. Yes, it was a social problem, absolutely, with a lot of unhappiness in the public. But I think the Chinese have come to understand that it affects the quality of their development. And the pace of China's development, whether it's growing, at 8% or now 6%, is important, but not. It cannot be seen solely from the perspective of the pace. It has to be seen as quality. And it's really interesting also in some of the Belt and Road projects where we've seen some of these coal-fired plants also canceled. And quite frankly, I'm surprised. I thought that without more pressure from the international community that we wouldn't see this. And maybe COVID-19 has provided an opportunity for a pause in China's BRI project to improve some of the investments and the things that they are building in infrastructure to do a better job, because we all know that at the second BRI plenum, Xi Jinping admitted there were problems that happened and that they needed to improve the way that they were implementing their BRI projects. And I think coal again was one of them. So I think it is really a concern, but how they rack and stack it with their other priorities, that I don't know. I still think that the pace of overall economic growth is important. They're still setting sort of some general targets, and they're not willing to sacrifice everything in order to improve environmental protection. But it is now, I think, increasingly one of the key factors that the leadership must take into account. That said, we have not seen a real blueprint for how China will pursue its target of becoming carbon neutral by 2060, or peaking in its carbon emissions by 2030. And many countries would like to see those targets brought forward because they are farther out than many other countries. And particularly the near-term plan for peaking carbon emissions in 2030, I think there's a widely held view that that's just not soon enough if we are going to cap the global emissions to an increase in global warming to 1.5 degrees. So there's more work to be done. There's more pressure that's being put on China. But so far, we have not seen China really provide any concrete plans or willingness to consider bringing those targets forward. And yet COP26 is only 2 months away.
Thank you. As we don't have any further questions right now waiting in the list. I would ask one of my own. In Europe, we have pondered for a while how to call our relationship with China. Is it, like you mentioned also in your presentation, is it cooperation? Is it rivalry? Are we adversaries or something like that? But to me, I think not that often asked question is how does China see us? And as you mentioned also in your presentation about this industrial policies made in China 2025, talent recruitment, 1,000 talents program. Of course, these are mainly focused on technology and economy, but China is a firm believer that with the enhancement of economic resources and capabilities, with it also goes together, especially also its project or approach to civil military fusion, also as a side product or also as important product is also building up this world class or military. So my question is that and just to mention maybe a few documents from this Chinese view on us or in the West, maybe US and Europe maybe separately, is also like the document number 9. This quite well known document in the China circles, and also like you mentioned, the 14 commands or to Australia. So could you maybe elaborate on how China sees us, the West, and maybe US and Europe separately? Thank you.
Such an interesting question, Frank. I have focused a lot of my career on understanding how China views the United States, so I could talk a lot about that. I'm learning more about how China views Europe as I have joined GMF, but Europe, I think, is hard for China to deal with. Because of it, I mean, it's obviously not one country. China would like to divide all of the European countries, deal with all of them individually. It doesn't like, I think, having to deal with the EU. I think China's been comfortable in dealing with Germany as a very strong leader of the EU and having this good relationship with Merkel. That has been a good structure for them. And I think they're a bit concerned about what will happen going forward after the German elections. And whether or not they will be able to, going forward, to deal more with sort of one leader, or whether they will have to create something new. But Europe has always been seen as a potential pole in the international order by China. They have tried to promote it as an independent pole in what China would like to see as a more multipolar order. And multipolar means for China a less US dominant order, weakened US hegemony and an increase in China's own power. So China has certainly tried and continues to try to drive a wedge between the United States and Europe. And I think that China would like to particularly weaken democracies around the world. And the United States and its own performance economically as well as politically, whether we look at the riots that took place on January 6th, or how poorly the United States has done in handling COVID-19, and now our withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Chinese are using all of these opportunities to portray the United States as in decline. And there is a phrase that has become very popular in China in recent years: the East is rising, the West is declining. This perception started really in the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. And the Chinese increasingly have confidence that that capitalism and democracy are in decline. I think that is quite dangerous, because it really could lead to confidence that China might then miscalculate, perhaps use force against Taiwan, for example. One of the reasons that people are concerned about the use of force against Taiwan is because China might calculate that the United States doesn't think that Taiwan is as important to it as it is to China. So for China, the United States has just always been the country that poses the biggest challenges to China. And I think China has always tried to shape its own goals vis-a-vis the United States. In fact, there's a good argument to be made that China has, since the late 80s and the early 90s, China has seen the United States really as an enemy. And this was, again, the book, The Long Game by Rush Doshi. He argues in this book that there was this trifecta of events that took place: Tiananmen Square, the Gulf War, and then the collapse of the Soviet Union, that led the Chinese to actually see the United States as very much in adversarial terms. And even in the 90s, when the US and China had better relations, that the Chinese were seeking to blunt US power and push back on the United States. So China, I think, has seen the United States as an enemy for a long time. I don't think that China has necessarily seen Europe as an enemy, although there is greater friction in the relationship between the United States and many European countries and the EU overall. And if the EU becomes more involved in imposing sanctions on China, places like Xinjiang, or getting more actively involved in the Indo-Pacific around China's periphery, indeed, China may get to the point where it does see Europe as an adversary.
Thank you. There's a question from one of the presenters, Bart Gaens, from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, and he asked, how do you assess possibilities for the Quad to counter China? Will it remain below the radar and informer, or will the Biden administration be eager to make it more tangible and openly containing China, also thinking about other related agreements like most recent Australia, UK, US arrangement? Thank you.
That's a great question about the Quad, which, of course, like any multilateral organization, if we can call it that, it's really informal, and it's certainly not an institution. It doesn't have a secretariat, for example. But like any organization with several countries that are part of it, it really has to operate by consensus. So it can only do what all four countries want to do. And even if the Biden administration had the ambition of institutionalizing the Quad or making it more security focused, even if Australia and Japan were willing to do so, I think that India is the member that is most concerned about being too defense focused and being hostile potentially toward China. So the United States is very careful to not call the Quad an anti-China organization, just like it has not termed AUKUS as targeted at China with Australia and the UK. But both of these mechanisms, I think, should be seen as examples of new architecture in the region. The Biden administration is quite keen to develop more architecture to strengthen democratic cooperation in the region and use that to bolster the rules-based international order. They are very much aimed at constraining China. And there's a difference between constraining and containing. We're not trying to prevent China's rise, but we are trying to limit China's very negative behavior, the coercion against countries, for example, that China is using, whether it's economic, diplomatic, or military coercion. So I think the Quad needs to. It doesn't need to be more than just defense focused. And when the leaders met virtually last time, the emphasis was on vaccine production, bringing together production, distribution capabilities, and and then providing public goods, particularly to countries in Southeast Asia, so making it more relevant to countries. And so I think that's very welcome in the ASEAN states. I think at this leadership summit just coming up that we're going to see in person, I think we will probably see Taiwan mentioned in the leader statement for the first time. It was mentioned in the foreign minister statement a few weeks ago, and I think that's a preview of what we will see. So more in discussion about some of these security issues, but also discussion about infrastructure and connectivity and supply chains. And these are the areas where India, I think, is somewhat more comfortable. So China's behavior is the biggest variable in what the Quad will do. If China is more aggressive toward India, then I think we'll see New Delhi a little bit more willing to be forward-leaning. But I think it's a very important organization, and these are 4 really strong leading democracies. And one of the things that we're working on at GMF is looking at Quad Plus activities. So how could other countries work with the Quad on some of these activities, even not being sort of members of the club, but just engaging in activities? And so we're looking at Quad Plus activities with both Europe and also Asian countries that are not a part of the Quad. And I think there's a lot of potential there.
Thank you. Next question from Kristi Raik, Estonian Foreign Policy Institute. How do you assess the potential for enhanced EU-US cooperation vis-a-vis China? What are the most promising sectors and issues?
Well, I'm very bullish on EU-US cooperation, and part of GMF's mission is to promote transatlantic cooperation. That is our main mission. So I'm really quite eager to promote cooperation on China. I don't think that we have any hope of influencing China's choices and shaping its foreign policy without working together closely with the EU. So I think the EU is critical, and for that reason, I'm quite concerned about France's very negative reaction to the new AUKUS arrangement. And I do hope that some repair work is done, both by Australia and the United States, because France has been important in helping to persuade other countries in the EU about the importance of the Indo-Pacific. And I think the new EU strategy is excellent, the Indo-Pacific strategy that has just come out. So the most promising areas probably are those where values are at stake, and promoting democracy and strengthening our democracies. We've seen progress in Xinjiang and human rights and forced labor, getting forced labor out of supply chains. I think there's also promising areas in the areas of technology overall. On the 29th, we will see the Trade and Technology Council launch in Pittsburgh, and I think we'll see some good things come out of that. But there are also areas when it comes to trade and economics where I think the EU and US will face some challenges. You know, the US would like to support some export controls. I think that might be more difficult with the EU. The US is eager to put in place some restrictions on outbound investment into China. I'm not sure how much of an appetite there is in the EU for that, but these are areas that, you know, we're going to continue to work on. So that the hard security cooperation, I think, will probably be limited to a small number of member states in the EU, not the EU overall, but there's just a number of areas where I think we're beginning to expand cooperation, and I remain quite bullish. I hope we can get over the hump with France.
Thank you, Bonnie. And on this positive note, it is also good to end the talk. Just to mention what relationship is without challenges. We just have to stay committed to overcoming them, and then anything would be possible. So thank you again, Bonnie, for your wonderful presentation and willingness to answer the questions. Thank you for the audience for all your wonderful questions. Unfortunately, our time has come to the conclusion and we cannot all ask them. But stay tuned. Hopefully, we'll still have a chance to have Bonnie here physically present in Tallinn in the future, hopefully near future. So thank you all and wish you all the best. And a reminder, if you have not started listening to Bonnie's podcast, then please do it. It is truly worth the time. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks for having me.